And so, we're finishing up here with primitive mythology. This will be the last video for this volume, Volume 1 of the Masks of God, Primitive Mythology. We're on the last chapter, the second to last chapter here, chapter 10, and subsection 3, the Great Diffusion. And now, whereas last time, what we had been looking at was a chronological listing going through the harmonization process, going all the way through the history of civilization, looking for mythogenetic zones. This second half of the chapter then is concerned with geography, with the spatial dissemination and diffusion of high civilization from the one mythogenetic zone in the Fertile Crescent there, right there in Mesopotamia, between the two rivers, where with all these little tiny city-states, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, all these city-states, Shuruppak, they all come into being right about 3500 BC, and civilization there up and running. And so then Campbell is interested in tracing the route by way of which this mammoth idea, this brand new idea that civilization could be organized with myths of dying and reviving beings, god kings, whose reigns are punctuated by astronomical numbers, which delimit one way or another the length of his reign and his subsequent death, sacrifice, resurrection, and so forth. So it gets migrated, it goes down in the southwestward diffusion to Africa, to Egypt, where by 3000 BC, Egyptian civilization is off and running, but it is clear that there has been a passing of the torch from Mesopotamia. Oswald Spengler created this concept, a very useful idea, called the pseudomorphosis, which is what happens when one civilization that is coming along begins to express itself through the form language of another older civilization that is lying over it, and which it is having trouble thrusting itself up, out, through, and breaking away the shell from. Because a pseudomorphosis in geology is apparently what happens when you get a rock. You break it open, and it's a different rock on the inside than what it is on the outside. It's had to express itself through a false formation, a pseudomorphosis. And I think, indeed, that is what happened with Egypt at the beginning. Most of its monuments for the first couple of dynasties are built in mud brick, some stone, but mostly mud brick, which was almost all of the monuments in Mesopotamia were built in mud brick. Then you look at examples like on the back of the Narmer palette, which is one of the first great works of art about 2900 BC. The image there on the back of the two lions with serpent heads entwining each other to form a caduceus is a figure that is totally alien to the form language of the Egyptian formal vocabulary, and has migrated over from Mesopotamia. In addition, there's a lot of other things that clearly, this is during the Urukian period of dominance, when the city-state of Uruk was in command about 3200 BC of all the trade routes, going down the Persian Gulf, going into Egypt. It was right there at the core center of the dispersal and diffusion of all of this. And the central myth, of course, in Egypt is a variation of the Inanna myth of death and resurrection, the descent into the underworld. In this case, it has to do with the four basic protagonists, who are all brothers and sisters: Osiris and Isis, who are brother and sister consorts, and Nephthys and Set. And then the story goes that one night Osiris makes the indiscretion, whether consciously or not, of sleeping with his brother's wife, Nephthys. And from that union, by the way, springs the jackal-headed boy Anubis, who is one of the gods of the underworld. The priests who perform the mummification ceremonies are usually wearing the mask of Anubis while they do the ceremony. And then so he gets in trouble. Set finds out about it. He's not happy, and he hatches a plan to capture Osiris by getting the dimensions of his body and making a coffin that fits him perfectly. They throw a party. Anyone who can fit inside the coffin can have it. The Egyptians are always concerned about the afterlife and about their graves and what will happen when they get buried. So Osiris gets in. He tries it on. It won't fit anyone else, but it fits him perfectly. And then they clap a lid over him and put 72 nails in the coffin. 72 is, of course, an astronomical number that is associated with the precession of the equinoxes. Every 72 years, the precession precesses 1 degree backwards through the zodiac. So it's very likely that it's connected with that, but it also may be a reference to the 70-day cycle of the constellation of Orion, which Osiris was associated with. His consort Isis was the star Sirius that goes along with it, and it undergoes a cycle where it takes 70 days for it to come back. And so 70 days became the basic structure for the mummification process. It should take place over 70 days, because this is a sort of dying and reviving constellation. But the constellation in the north, where the constellations, the stars, what are called the deathless ones, circle around the pole star, which at that time was Thuban, are deathless because they never set below the horizon. They just go in a tight circle around that central axial pivot. And so what happens then is that Osiris is dead. He's inside the coffin, and it washes ashore where a tamarisk tree grows over it. And a king wanders by who's looking for a perfect pillar as the central pivot of his palace. This is, of course, the pole star. He finds it. He brings the pillar back. And the pole star, it's interesting because the way the pole star is to be imagined, this axial pivot that Osiris is now on the inside of as a tree, which is used now for the central pillar of this king's house, is also the spinal backbone of Osiris. It's meant to be his spinal column. It's also the pole star. But it's interesting because the way that the vertebrae are stepped actually gets magnified with the first pyramid of Zoser to become the cosmic mountain idea that's combined with the spinal backbone of Osiris as the stepped, tiered cosmic mountain that creates a cosmic ladder by way of which the pharaoh's Ka climbs up and makes its way to the deathless ones, the constellations whirling like birds around the pole star. Osiris's backbone is the ladder, so hence the central concern with the pivot in this story. And so Isis finds out where he's at. She goes and puts herself out, hires herself to the king's wife as a babysitter, and one day she's rolling the child around in the fire. The flames are burning away his mortal element, but the queen comes in, finds this, fires her instantly, and of course the child does not gain immortality as a result. But she has to have the pillar, and the king is gracious enough to give it to her, from which she extracts the coffin of Osiris, puts it on a barge, and goes downriver. Now, she performs some sort of a magical spell on it, that even while dead, he is capable of having an erection. So she gets his phallus erect, climbs up on top of him, and conceives their son Horus, the sun god. He will be the god of the sun with the solar disk. And so Set, meanwhile, is out hunting boar one day when he happens upon the body of Osiris in the swamps, hidden away, and he's furious. So he has it torn into 14 separate pieces and discarded to the 4 different directions. So Isis and Nephthys and Anubis all get together and hunt for the pieces. And in one version of the myth, wherever they find a piece and bury it, a food plant springs up, wheat or whatever. But in the main line of myth, they find all the pieces, put them together, except for the phallus, which has been swallowed by a fish, because Osiris is no longer a biological god. He's shifting to a supernatural order. He's going to become the lord of the underworld. And so indeed, he does so when Horus, after a battle with his uncle Set, avenges his father's murder and comes back with the magical eye of Horus, the sun orb, which they shine upon the body of Osiris and resurrects it. And then he goes down to the underworld, Amenti, where he becomes the lord of the dead. And like in the Inanna myth, Inanna also journeys down to the underworld where her sister, the twin image of her, in that case it's the double goddess, is the mistress of the underworld who judges the dead. In this case, we have Osiris. But clearly there are some affinities between these two mythological complexes. And so Campbell then traces the diffusion of civilization into the northwestward zone, where we find at Menon Crete this idea of the myth that every 8 years, the Athenians are supposed to send 7 boys and 7 girls to be sacrificed to King Minos, fed to the Minotaur, who's housed inside of the labyrinth there. And that number, every 8 years this happens, is of course associated with the planet Venus. This is what Fraser thinks it is. Homer says it's actually 9 years that Minos became king at the age of 9, but I think it's more accurate and likely that it's 8 because the planet Venus is crucial to all of this. It has an 8-year cycle where it goes back and reappears 8 years later at exactly the same spot in the zodiac that it was in 8 years earlier. And so this becomes a great year, which often gets split in half into 2 kings who reign as brothers, one 4 years, the other 4 years, as a sort of great year, the 4 years corresponding to the first 6 months of the year, the other 4 years corresponding to the latter 6 months of the year, approaching summer solstice, then approaching winter solstice. This is why you get the twins, like in Sophocles with the 2 brothers there who are fighting over the kingship. So we find the myth here, and it's obviously migrating, and it makes a continual northwestern diffusion to Newgrange, where we find it in Ireland, 3200 BC, Campbell says. Newgrange, which is a large, basically a gigantified kurgan mound that's 42 feet tall. And the kurgans have come from another culture across going, this is the nomadic zone, the zone of the horse-riding Indo-Aryan nomads who originate in some area of the Caucasus Mountains or north of the Black Sea, Black and Caspian Seas, somewhere in that region. And they've been going back and forth above this zone of high civilization, generation 1, as Toynbee calls it, of civilization. These guys will be involved in the second generation, but they're not involved in the first, which is not Indo-Aryan at all. But nonetheless, they bury their dead, these Indo-Aryans do, in what are called kurgan mounds, where they take a warrior and they kill off his family, bury the family with him, so we have regicide, some form of it anyway, practiced in connection with the deeds of a great man, who is buried with his battle axes and his horses in a single grave, which become these huge monuments. And eventually the kurgans migrate over into Ireland, where Campbell recounts a short, charming little myth, the myth about Oisin, where we find the kingship motif in accordance with astronomical cycles once again. Oisin is a hunter, and so he is out hunting, but he's been troubled lately by the apparition of this woman with a pig's head. Every now and then he sees her in the distance, and it troubles him. He doesn't know what she is. And so he's out hunting one day with all of his friends, and they're partaking in a great hunt. They have a huge catch, which they then are wrestling to bring back, but it's too much. So his friends leave him, and he's there by himself with all these dead animals, and he's trying to figure out how to haul them. When she shows up with the pig's head and says, "I have magical powers. I can help you with these. I will carry your load for you." So the two walk for a while until Oisin becomes tired, and they take a rest next to a tree. And as she's resting, he notices that she has a very beautiful body. And he says, if it just wasn't for your head, you're very beautiful. So she says, well, actually, I am very beautiful. My father put a spell on me. My father is the king of the land of eternal youth. I'm his daughter. He put a spell on her using a druidic wand that transformed her beautiful face into the face of a pig. And any man who marries me, the face will transform back. And Oisin says, I'll do that for you. So he agrees to marry her. So they travel back to her father's castle in this mystical land, the land of eternal youth. They get married. Her face turns back to a normal face. He's delighted with how beautiful she is. And then he finds there that the king has a 7-year reign. Every 7 years, they have to elect a new king. And they do this apparently by this ritual of simply the first person who can run to the top of this hill where the chair is and sits in it, becomes the next king for 7 years. And when they're all getting about ready to do this, they look up and they see that Oisin is already at the top of the hill, sitting in the king's spot. So there again, we have the myth of punctuated rulership, punctuated authority that always is connected with an astronomical number here. This is the motivating impulse now for high civilization. Everything is governed by mathematics, astronomy, and astrology now. In one way or another, it provides the conditioning materials for the organization of civilization. Campbell then next looks at the eastward migrations here as the book finishes off. The southeastward diffusion going right around the corner from Mesopotamia down the Persian Gulf to Harappa, which is the old Indus Valley civilization. Now, the strange thing about this civilization, a lot more archaeology has come in on it. And there are a lot more sites than there was in Campbell's time, where he's only just talking about the 3 sites here of Mohenjo-daro, which is in the south, Harappa, which is in the north, and Chanu-daro. And but a lot more sites. We've got Ganwiri-Wala and Rakigarhi, Lotal, a whole bunch of new sites have come in. And the interesting thing is that archaeologists have figured out that there was some sort of strange event that happened here 2600 BC, where all the previous settlements were razed, burned to the ground, wiped out all over the north and the south of this Indus Valley, going right along the Indus River, with all these different sites, a whole bunch of them, over a vast geographical distance. Somehow, almost overnight, they're all wiped out, burned down, and then rebuilt in accordance with a standardized ground plan, where they have mud brick, baked brick architecture, cities that are laid out on a grid, geometrically on an angular grid, with writing that comes in now, complex drainage and sewer systems, And it's all standardized at all of these sites. This could only have been done by some sort of sacred religious authority who has invested some type of power at this point to provide the Indus Valley with a vision, with capital V. And everyone accorded with it. So it was apparently some sort of ruling priestly elite that did this and bound Harappan civilization together, which lasted for about 1,000 years until the Indo-Aryans then come pouring in and breaking it up. It may already have been weakened by a plague, which is what I suspect. But there's civilization again, migrating around the corner. We also find, apparently from stamp seals there, we find individuals in yoga posture with serpents. So apparently yoga is already up and running at Harappa. Then Campbell looks at Chinese civilization, the northeastern eastward arc that migrates to China, and we get the Yangshao farmers who are peaceful farming folk. But the Lungshan and other people come in, the Lungshan, and they're very aggressive and acquisitive and warlike, and they create, for the first time, walled settlements. They conquer the Yangshao, and the two of those societies fuse together to begin to form what eventually becomes Shang Dynasty, China, about 1500 BC, which is a completely magnificent affair. They do practice, just as at Sir Leonard Woolley's ritual regicide together with mass graves and burials of attendants that have been found in connection with Anyang and Sufatun. Sites of this nature, which feature these huge regicidal burials, were all kinds, just like the exact Chinese equivalent of what Sir Leonard Woolley unearthed in the Near East there. And they've got these they've got the shamanistic cult with these beautiful bronzes that apparently was the primary mythologum holding this whole thing together. These bronze animals that are in the shapes of tigers and dragons that the emperor, going into a shamanistic trance state, is said to ride upon to the upper world or the underworlds, any of the shamanic zones, where he is then able to communicate with the dead ancestors using these bronzes. And they went to war over each other with these bronzes, a little bit like the rings in Lord of the Rings. Whoever had these bronzes was at the center of this shamanistic cult of communing with the ancestors. So here we have the idea also, the astronomical idea of the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven is this idea that heaven, Qian, which is circular, and the earth is a square, the two are held together like with a sort of umbrella at the center of a chariot. The mandate of heaven can be withdrawn. If there is the observation of an eclipse, a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse, it may be a sign from the gods that the mandate of heaven is going to be withdrawn from this or that particular dynasty. And indeed, they use this to explain the transition of power from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty, that the mandate of heaven was withdrawn from the Shang for whatever reason. They weren't performing the rites correctly, or whatever the reason retroactively happens to be thought to be. They lose the mandate of heaven, and then you get a collapse, a calamity, and another dynasty comes in. And that becomes the basis of Chinese civilization, where we do find in the Shang dynasty the first appearance of a number of art motifs that migrate across the Pacific and are found in the New World, one of which is the Totem Pole, which is put together, this idea of the ancestral beings that are stacked in vertical array, is something that eventually somehow makes it across the waters to the Northwest Pacific Coast Indians, who also have the art of the Totem Pole, as well as a lot of other motifs. Campbell is always fond of cataloging all these motifs that migrated across the Pacific, and there's a lot of them. And then he finishes off then with the myth of the dying god, going all the way into the New World, Mesoamerica, with the myth of Quetzalcoatl. Now, Quetzalcoatl is one of the great cultural bringers. He's living in the city of the sun, Tula, when his brother, his dark brother, kind of like Set against Osiris, Tezcatlipoca, conceives this plot to undermine his reign by showing him this image in a mirror. They have mirrors in Mesoamerica. They have a whole cult associated especially with polished obsidian mirrors. And it's interesting, I think, that he conceives the plan to undo Quetzalcoatl by showing him what his real face looks like. He's an old man, apparently. He's never seen what he looks like. Because Mesoamerican civilization was a civilization that was really ruled and governed by the mask. Everyone appears wearing a mask at any public occasion, any formal occasion, even informal ones. Everyone's always wearing some sort of a mask, usually of an animal with open jaws, out of which the individual is peering because he has been swallowed up by the transpersonal powers of the astral plane and this very elaborate cult of the ancestors. But here, Tezcatlipoca does indeed go to his brother, shows him his face, and it so traumatizes Quetzalcoatl. He's so traumatized and upset by it that he gets drunk and has sex with his sister. So he seduces his sister. They both get drunk. They wake up the next morning, and he's horrified. He's completely mortified at the sin that he's committed here of incest, which was apparently a big no-no, unlike in Egypt, apparently a big no-no in Mesoamerica. And then he decides to leave. He's going to disengage from civilization. And we've seen this motif. You see it in the two examples of Gilgamesh. The Gilgamesh narrative concerns, we saw the Inanna cult with her descent into the underworld and the cosmic spheres, but his whole narrative is based on a reaction against that official state religion and going off to find his own antidote to that. Also, Akhenaten's revolt against the Theban priesthood, 1350 BC or so, is another example of discontent against the religious authorities of the official state apparatus and the attempt of an individual to disengage and go off and found his own religious micro-event in opposition to the ruling religion of the state apparatus, whatever it happens to be. And in this case, Quetzalcoatl decides to leave Tula. He's very sorrowful about it, and to go on a migration and just exile himself. And he's going along through the jungles. Most of his entourage is dying off of various illnesses and so forth. They meet necromancers. The necromancers want him to teach them various arts of metallurgy and whatever it is, necromancy, divination, agriculture. He teaches them all of these things as he goes along because he's a Promethean type culture bringer, culture figure. Until he comes to the shore and he builds a raft out of serpents and he gets on it and he floats off. But there is an opposite version, another version, an alternate version of the myth in which he's actually cremated and his body is cremated except for his heart, which then goes up to become the morning star, Venus. So I note that Venus is generally masculine, by the way, in the East. It's feminine in the West. For the Indians, for the Hindus, and the Chinese, and the Mesoamericans, Venus is masculine. I find that interesting, that gender switch with the astrology there. And so then it's prophesied that after the end of a cycle, Quetzalcoatl, I think it is, one reed, which happens at once every 52 years, supposedly Quetzalcoatl will return from the east, bearing a white visage, a white beard. And of course, when Cortez showed up in 1492, he fit the myth, or when Cortez showed up, not Columbus, when Cortez showed up, he fit the myth perfectly. And they really thought, because it occurred in the year one reed, Quetzalcoatl, that he had returned, that Quetzalcoatl had come back as the form of these whites. And so the myth of the dying and reviving god, as we see, then circumnavigates the globe. So that's Campbell's model for the geographic dispersion and diffusion of the mythogenetic nuclear zone of the myth of the dying and reviving ruler whose reign is punctuated in accordance with the stars that comes out of Mesopotamia. He finishes, we'll conclude here with his little concluding idea about the function of myth, where he borrows from Hindu philosophy, this idea that there are three fundamental aims by which everyone lives, and they are kama, artha, and dharma. Kama is the pleasure principle, sexuality, the id. It's ingrained in our biology. Nobody can help it or do anything about it. It's simply there. It's a problem, but it is one of the primary aims of life, reproduction and pleasure through sexuality. Its opposing impulse is that of artha, which is power and aggression. And some people are more motivated by desire. Some people are more motivated by aggressive tendencies. This is the difference, Campbell says, between Freudian psychoanalysis, in which everything is powered by the id, libido, everything is sex, 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 in opposition to Nietzsche, for whom everything is the will to power. It's not erotic, fundamentally. It's power. The primary thing that motivates beings in life is power and aggression. Well, actually, as it turns out, it's both. And sometimes they can come in conflict with each other, these two drives. They're innate. They're part of us all. They all have to be dealt with one way or another. And the third aim is then dharma, which is the ruling social order, the job of which is to hold and check these impulses in place so that we can produce civilized behavior in a civilized society. And the dharma is usually backed with cosmological master signifieds, such as the way, the Tao, the Dharma, Mat in Egypt, whatever it happens to be, it's backed this sociological order of the evaluation of good and evil, morally good, morally bad, so forth. All of this tends to be backed by this master signifier of one sort or another, which throughout the series we've seen all kinds of examples of. But then there's a fourth aim. And the fourth aim is the opposite of these three. It is moksha, release. Those three bind the individual to the social order in one way or another, using vast mythological and metaphysical systems of religious control and authority that hold the society together. But the fourth principle is the metaphysical principle, which Campbell equates basically with as being the same in the East with moksha and nirvana in Hinduism and Buddhism, and in the West with the idea of aesthetic appreciation, as in the case of Schopenhauer or James Joyce, where for Schopenhauer, the aesthetic arrest, the appearance of the beautiful thing, the art object that disengages the will, which for Schopenhauer is fundamentally erotic and drives through all things, but the art object disrupts that, and you become the pure subject of the universe, beholding the pure object of the universe, and none of the biological aims have anything to do with that aesthetic arrest, which Schopenhauer says, other than monasticism, are the only two ways of disengaging from the biological enchainment to our sex drives, our power urges that enchain us as animal beings in biologically incarnate bodies. There's no other way except for this ecstatic release. And for Campbell, that's the main thing, that there should always be a way in society for the individual to disengage from the other three motives of bondage, artha, kama, dharma, and release in some way to the transcendent wonder and mystery of the universe, which should be represented in some way in a beautiful experience of either the beautiful or the sublime, whichever, but that he thinks the job of myth ultimately is to provide the individual with this rapturous release. And I think that concluding here now with primitive mythology, that's Campbell's final and best and most interesting, I think, message about the way in which mythology functions to hold civilization together. And so what we'll do next is Volume 2, Oriental Mythology, and we'll move through that next.